Great. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a few seconds while everyone joins. We'll kick off shortly. Great. So thanks for joining us for our webinar this afternoon, looking at longevity. Is it the missing link in the climate change debate? So I'm Lily Parsi. I'm currently head of projects at ILC, and I've jumped in a little last minute to chair this, but I'm really excited for the session. So over the next hour and a half, we're going to look at how longevity and climate change, sort of two of the big defining megatrends of our time, fit together, if there are some common solutions, common challenges, and how we get to kind of tackle those. I'm joined by a brilliant panel. We've got Dr. Louise Pryor from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries with us, Hannah Pathak from the Forum for the Future, Stephen Baxter from Club Vita, and our Chief Executive, David. And looking forward to all of your questions in the discussion as well. So I'm going to pass over pretty much immediately, just a few very quick things. Make sure you use the Q&A feature to ask any questions that we'll discuss later on. If you want to post any thoughts and questions on Twitter, then do go ahead as well. And I think our handle is on one of these slides. And we've also got live captions enabled. So if you want to use subtitles, just click on that. A little bit of background about us. So the ILC is the UK's specialist think tank on the impact of longevity on society. So we really look in the UK and across the world at how the fact that we're all living a little bit longer is going to affect the future of health, the future of places, the future of work, and so on. And we've been over the past year or two really looking at how climate change kind of fits into this narrative and where there's some common solutions. And if David, you could just move on one slide. I wanted to say a big thank you as well to our partners. So our partners program makes sure lots of our work happens in this area, and a special thanks as well to the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries who have made this series of events possible, where we look at how longevity fits into other sort of big defining trends of our time. So without much further ado, I'm really excited to pass over to Dr. Louise Pryor, who's going to kick us off today with some thoughts. And is going to talk a little bit about the impact of climate change on longevity in the UK and globally, and how we can kind of affect some change in relation to this. So over to you.
Thank you, Lily, and welcome to everybody. It's very nice to, well, virtually imagine you're here, even if I can't see anyone. So climate change, the climate emergency, what effect does it have on longevity? Well, it actually, I think, has a number of different impacts through a number of different pathways. So I'm just going to be very straightforward and just go through all the impacts that there could be. And I hope this will help set the scene for the rest of the discussion. So firstly, we've got the direct mortality impacts. Climate change can kill people pretty directly. We are seeing, for example, increased heat deaths in the summer in the UK. We are also, of course, seeing reduced cold deaths in the winters as we get these slightly warmer winters and slightly warmer summers. We're also seeing increased severe weather globally. We've got fires all over the place. We've got floods all over the place. The mortality in Pakistan is not going to be the same this year as it has been in previous years. A lot of people are being killed, and that is pretty directly through climate change, and we have to think about that. However, these direct mortality effects are probably not the most significant. We've also got direct health effects, so not actually killing people directly, but making them sort of more likely to die, if you see what I mean, just because they're less well. Again, you've got the effect from the heat and cold, but you've also got coming in the disease factors. So with the changing climate, changing weather patterns around the world, we're going to get disease vectors such as mosquitoes, various other invertebrates, all sorts of, a lot of diseases have quite complex life cycles, if you like, with carriers at various stages in the pathogen's lives. And we're going to see changes in that, with the disease vectors being viable in different geographies from where they have been before. And of course, resistance varies. If you get the vectors active in a part of the world where nobody's ever had that disease before, it's likely to have quite a severe impact. So there's all those things to think about. And some of that, that there is one particular one whose name has just completely escaped me as I'm sitting here talking to you, that there is likely to be some worsening experience in the UK. So it's not just the tropics that this applies to, it is in fact all over the world. We're also going to see social changes because of climate change. We all hear the stories about mass migrations and social unrest, and I think those are absolutely things that we should be looking out for, and they by their very nature tend to have adverse mortality consequences. But another thing that we need to think about is the changing viability of various forms of agriculture and various crops. As the climate changes around the world, we're going to see the growing conditions vary, and some crops are simply not going to be viable in places where they've hitherto been grown. And that, of course, can produce both food shortages, but it can also produce lifestyle changes. So different nutrition patterns, all those sorts of things. And all these things have an impact on people's health and on people's lifespans. Now, what's going to happen if we actually get our act together as a world, as a civilization, and do something about climate change and manage to stop it or slow it down or whatever, and we transition to a low carbon economy? Guess what? There's going to be impacts from that too. You've got financial and economic impacts. Is it going to be lower growth, for example? What's it going to do to government policies? Is it going to cut social welfare support in various areas, make it less affordable? All these things. Is it going to make people need more support in any case because of things like cost of living crises through energy shortages, or anything in that way could happen? So those are other forms of changes. So we're probably going to get quite big impacts either from the actual climate change or from a transition which stops or slows the climate change happening. And allied to all this are even more indirect effects. So in severe weather, you might think, oh, well, there's all these floods and things, people are going to be injured in the floods, etc., etc. Yes, but what's also going to happen, and this certainly applies to everywhere, including the UK, is that some of the service providers, their operations are affected by the severe weather. So healthcare workers can't get to work. Hospitals are affected by floods. And all these things can have long-term impacts on people's health and on their mortality. So we got to think about impacts on healthcare systems, impacts on education, because we know that education is a big driver of long-term of longevity rates and so on, and other service delivery, so social care services and things as well. So what I want you to take away from this is that it's not simple, that everything is interconnected, because, you know, bad weather can then cause public transport breakdowns, which makes it harder for people to get to work, which means that some people aren't going to get paid or are going to get paid less, and so on. So everything's interconnected. It's a big systems problem. So what can we do about this? What might people do, or governments do, or anybody do to try and address some of these problems? Well, the obvious thing is mitigation, to try and stop the climate emergency happening, reduce our carbon emissions and so on. However, whatever happens, some climate change is happening, has already happened. We are going to need more resilience. especially to severe weather impacts, but also things like further pandemics that may well happen, either because of biodiversity loss, which isn't necessarily the same thing as climate change, but is certainly often related, or through direct disease vector issues. So we're going to have to be resilient. We're going to have to adapt to the change. We're going to have to change the way we do things as the world around us changes. And all these are things that our policymakers need to be thinking about ways they can do this, and the trade-offs that there are, short-term versus long-term. Is it worth sacrificing some of our lifestyle now in order to, for example, be able to live longer in a comfortable way in the future? So these are some of the questions that I think we're all going to be thinking about over the next hour or so.
Brilliant, and that's a massive brief. So I hope our follow-on speakers can add a little bit to that. And I think you're right, there is a sort of huge complexity in this. And I think some of the problems you talk about here in terms of short-term versus long-term are the same ones we're talking about when we look at sort of adapting to demographic change.
Yeah.
So we are really facing, sort of big long-term changes that need to be done in a system that's potentially more short-term. I'm going to pass over to Hannah Pathak next, who is Director for UK and Europe at Forum for the Future. And I'm really looking forward to hear from you.
Great, thanks Lily, and thanks Louise. And I'm going to continue the theme of it's all complicated and it's all interconnected as well, because that's very much how we look at things at Forum for the Future. So for those of you not familiar with Forum, we've been around for 26 years. We take both a sort of systems change lens to look at big global challenges, so really trying to understand problems in their complexity, but also a futures lens as well. So very much trying to look ahead as to what are the various different trends that are going to be kind of shifting how we live and operate in society over the next 10, 20 years or so, but really crucially how they might interact with each other. And in a way, that's where it gets really interesting, because that's where unexpected things kind of start to come out when we start to analyze kind of converging trends and so on. Just briefly on my background, I've been at Forum for 3 years and I've worked in climate change pretty much my whole career, one way and another, but it's been quite varied. And that's included overseeing climate research in remote places around the world, through to advising on strategy, mostly for the private sector, which is what I do now, but also direct disaster response to humanitarian crises as well. So very much the sharp end of climate effects. So for example, responding to the 2017 hurricanes in the Caribbean. So very much seen firsthand the kind of impacts that climate exacerbated events or climate caused events can have, and what that means at the very personal individual level, and what that means for people's health and their well-being and their resilience and so on. I also co-lead our climate and health coalition work at the moment, which is working with a number of healthcare partners. And we're trying to provide guidance to the private sector on how they can look at this intersection between climate and health. Really interestingly, one of the things that we've really kind of come to realize through this year is that a lot of companies have got their net zero commitments and so on, but they're starting to come up against the edge of their own sphere of control. So it's not that they can't do more, they absolutely can and should, and the full sum of all of the net zero commitments that have been made won't get us to within the Paris Agreement as things stand. So it's not that there can't be more that can be done, but they're starting to realise the edge of the possibility within their sphere of control. So it really starts to take a look at what's in their sphere of influence and what needs to change. And I know, for example, that David's going to be talking about policy, for example. So things like policy and financial flows are really key as we start to look at that kind of wider system and the wider operating environment. So Louise has brilliantly spelled out some of the relationships between climate and health. And I think what's really clear, probably to this group, but perhaps not so widely generally, is that some of the drivers behind climate change are also drivers behind poor health as well. So such as air pollution, for example, or loss of nature and biodiversity. So, and I think this is it's trying to map these relationships between climate and health to get to this better understanding of the intersection. And kind of at the fundamental premise, and when you say it, it sounds so obvious. You can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. It's just not possible. And yet at the moment, our policies and our financial structures and the way that we tend to do business, the way that sort of government happens, is that these things are seen in silos. And that is something that really needs to shift. And also, again, just picking up on some of the themes that Louise made there, is that anywhere that there's pre-existing vulnerability, whether that's poor health, or by being elderly, or having low literacy, or low social mobility, any kind of vulnerability will be exacerbated by climate change. And that's when you start to get kind of overlaying risks happening. And this is what we really need to be thinking about, is these kind of interconnecting risk factors when we look at vulnerability, because you then risk getting a downward spiral. And we're seeing this in Pakistan at the moment. You know, we're seeing there's deaths from the event itself. Now there's deaths from secondary disease impacts. And then we're seeing that people have lost their livelihoods. And what does that mean for their vulnerability going forward, and kind of their access to finances, to jobs, to be able to raise their children, and so on. So this kind of downward spiral of vulnerability is a real risk. But perhaps what's less talked about, but equally valid, is the relationship between resilience and being able to act on climate change. So healthier individuals, healthier communities or have more capacity to act on climate change. So there's kind of this possibility for a positive spiral as well, is that if we can be focusing on resilience at the individual and the community and the country level, that actually gives us better capacity to start to tackle climate change as well. So taking those kind of themes around resilience and vulnerability and the relationship there, as I think what comes through is really, really clear, is that the need to invest in well-being is a climate adaptation strategy in and of itself. So socioeconomic resilient people are better able to cope with climate change impacts, whether that's through insurance or whether that's through the ability to be able to access supplies or to save money and so on. In the same way that acting on some of the drivers on poor health are a climate mitigation strategy as well. And it just really sort of drives home we need to be thinking about these things within the same frame. Louise also talked there about some kind of some other sort of secondary impacts of climate change, specifically around kind of forced migration as well. And I just wanted to pick up on that one particularly and its relationship with longevity. Some estimates are that there'll be 1.2 billion climate migrants by 2050. So that's 1 in 8 people around the world. That's a vast number of people on the move. That's an extraordinary number of people to be thinking about in terms of how we look at migration, whether that's within borders or beyond borders. Taking that fact or that possible outcome, and then also thinking that many societies have an aging population, so they have less people in the tax-paying bracket, they have possibly higher needs that need to be supported. What do we need to be thinking about from perhaps our immigration policies and our taxation policies to think about this flow of people on the one hand and this aging population that might need more monetary support on the other? And do we need to be thinking differently and taking a much bigger global lens to think about what that might mean and whether there's some ways of matching those two needs and challenges, because they're both going to be a reality. But I'll just kind of conclude really is kind of there's something inherent in thinking about longevity that's actually really key to how we also think about climate change, and that's long-termism effectively. You know, one of the kind of, I think it's fair to say, one of the key things that is true about our current challenges is a lot of them are because we naturally have quite short-term thinking, and our systems kind of encourage this. You know, in parliamentary terms are maybe 4 or 5 years depending on the country. Our financial returns are in quarters or in years. Everything's pretty short and quick. But actually what's being asked of us now is to be able to look ahead and go, actually, we need to be thinking 10, 20 years down the line for ourselves, for those that we love, for those still to come. And so this kind of shift in thinking to kind of long-termism really goes very well with thinking about longevity and how do you age well and how do you keep things. So finally, just to kind of call to action, it really just reinforces kind of the things that Louise was saying, is we need to be thinking about mitigation and adaptation. It's not an either or, both are urgent. We have to be doing both of these things, which is a massive challenge for leadership wherever people are in society. but really starting to focus our attention on these kind of gap areas that have come through around policy and finance, and what do we collectively need to do to shift our policy and to shift our financial mechanisms so that it better serves a longevity and a resilience and a climate change adaptation and response kind of ends. So I'll conclude there. Thanks, Lily.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Really, really interesting, and lots of points in there that, you know, I think the figures on sort of potential climate migrants is really massive, and I think much bigger than lots of us know or really planning for. And as you said, I think it's clearly such a big systems issue and a long-term issue. So it's interesting, actually. Dave and I, when we went to UAE a few years ago, we met with the Prime Minister's office, and they had a strategy for the next 50 years on ageing, and that was quite, I don't know, something we can't really imagine seeing here, but actually, you know, what that allows you to start thinking about and actually think about long-term returns is really exciting. Anyway, I'll pass over to Stephen now. Stephen Baxter, who is Head of Innovation and Development at Club Vita. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lily, and thank you so much to Louise and Hannah for those opening remarks. And it probably won't come at all surprise that I will be building on that theme of interconnectivity and what I say. At Club Vita, we very much look at analysing emerging information and data on how long people are living for the benefits of the pensions and insurance communities. And one of the key things that we've been looking at in recent years is how the climate change pathways might translate to health outcomes and outcomes in the ultimate event of how long we live for. So I'm going to look back a little bit to what Louise was saying at the outset, to some of the different direct and indirect effects, and describe how we've thought about them a bit and how we've tried to quantify that interconnectivity and what it therefore might actually mean for people from different generations. Now, I won't be able to do that full justice in a few minutes, David, so I'll probably leave some of that interconnectivity and policy side for yourself. But what I will do is just talk about some of the more quantitative aspects. And I'd like to start by just bringing home that point that Louise mentioned, that we often focus on climate change in terms of an impact in terms of temperature. And we often see graphics, particularly in the UK, much like this. This is a seminal study. It focused on 3 different pathways for climate change in terms of representative concentration pathways, but essentially lots of adaptation on the left versus current trajectory on the right. And the red and the blue is simply telling us the amount of deaths that would be added in the red for increase through deaths through heat-related deaths, and the blue is showing us what we'd have as less deaths as a consequence of less severe winters. And in Northern Europe, this actually could lead you to a very misleading conclusion that climate change or the temperature impacts have limited impact on human health, and if anything, seem to be slightly positive. And this is a really bad and wrong conclusion. I can't stress that strongly enough, because it's only looking at one very simple part of the problem, and it's taking a very, very insular perspective of the nice environments that we enjoy in Northern Europe. We don't have to go very far at all to get a dramatically different picture in terms of those hot and cold impacts. Southern Europe would see a dramatic increase in mortality unless we have significant adaptation, as shown by the pathway of those black dots on the right-hand side. But even this is incredibly naive, because it only talks about the direct impacts in terms of less direct cold-related or more heat-related deaths. With rising temperatures, we have issues with heat waves, more of them, more severe, longer duration. We're also likely to have more day-to-day volatility in temperatures, certainly in areas like the UK, where we are not resilient, to pick up one of Hannah's themes, to such issues. And finally, insulation seems a slightly odd one for me to remark on, but a lot of the analysis to date has been based upon historical relationships between temperature and mortality. And we mustn't forget that we've done significant adaptations already in the developed world in terms of improving our housing stock and insulation, which means some of the relationships these studies rely on are frail. And it's actually acknowledging these broader impacts that really changes our perspective. It already starts to change our perspective on the direct temperature impacts, but we also then need to start thinking about the wider impacts. Now, this is one of my favorite schematics in terms of direct impacts, but I'm not actually going to dwell on it today, other than to say you can see many of the items that Hannah and Louise so eloquently elaborated on already, things such as environmental degradation or factory ecology, the more widespread infectious diseases as many pathogens can thrive around the world. But I would argue that whilst these direct impacts are significant and are happening today in many parts of the world, it's still only part of the issue because it only deals with the direct impacts. And ultimately, our global financial and health systems are really intrinsically connected with climate change and the resources we're depleting, which are driving that anthropogenic climate change. So at Club Vita, we really sat down to think about this interconnectivity. We came up with a whole series of linkages that we thought were important when we think about the consequential impact on human health of climate change. Now, for the purposes of simplified illustration, I often just pick out two parts of those linkages, focusing on two elements of emissions which underpin climate change. And without wishing to cause offence to anyone, we often refer to this as our belching cows and belching cars part of the system. So, for instance, with cows, we know that the rearing of livestock for human production is a contributor to climate change. We can debate the exact proportion to which of global emissions which are attributable, but it is one of the parts of the chain, and it helps us illustrate some connectivities through the methane emissions contributing to the impacts that Hannah and Louise described, the direct impacts, through to thinking about actually there is a whole there is an output from the livestock, our dairy and our meat, and we know there is a linkage through the meat, through red meat, through diet to cancers, for example. So there is a linkage where part of our drivers for climate change are negatively associated with health outcomes. And of course, there's a whole aspect of how do we rear the livestock and the fact that there is an additional part of the emissions network that comes from them. Moving on to our belching cars, our transportation system, well, of course, we have the same issues with emissions through the manufacture and the use of vehicles, and that's consequential direct impacts as a catalyst for climate change. But we also have the air pollution angle. Not only does that significantly impact our respiratory health, but breaking studies very recently have shown how air pollution can be a trigger for cancer. But when I look at this, I also see another connectivity here. I'm also very conscious that for much of the world, is reliant on cars for transportation, and that's had a lifestyle impact. I also see a very important factor here that we, at least currently, rely on oil to fuel these vehicles. But oil is a scarce resource, and oil underpins our entire health system. It is essentially a petrochemicals industry through petrochemicals and a human labour industry, where we think about the medicines, the manufacture, the machinery, the transportation, that's all petrochemicals based. But also the very fact that our health system has, to many extents, a manageable demand on it is also down to the fact that in many countries, we've got significantly improved diets, access year-round to healthy diets, fruits, vegetables, etc., which becomes increasingly challenging for us to both meet the supply needs for the supply of with climate change through environmental degradation, but also the ability to transport food. So there's a direct linkage there that as the world around us changes, our ability to maintain our health also changes. So this led us to some pathways for longevity. I won't go into all the detail of them. They don't specifically relate to the representative concentration pathways often cited in the climate change discussions, but you'll probably be able to guess where they broadly align to. In the middle, we have our challenging times. That's really the trajectory I'd suggest we're on at the moment. There is some adaptation, but it's really only accelerating once it becomes the impact of finite resources really becomes apparent. And under this scenario, we see there will be significant fiscal challenges. There'll be much heightened pressures on the sustainability of our healthcare systems, and we will have challenges around diet. Now, what this will tend to lead is exemplified by the number at the bottom, is a reduction in life expectancy for individuals, but also a widening social inequality in health outcomes. What I fear we're on the trajectory for, and what I really hope doesn't happen, is the head in the sand scenario on the left. And that's where we essentially do not adapt anywhere near fast enough. We continue to have significant anthropogenic change. We'd be on those high global temperature increases pathway. Heat events leading to global crop failures, the vector-borne diseases would be much more rife. We'd see a reversal essentially in the developed world of our victory over infectious diseases. There'd be severe temperature fluctuations potentially, and definitely significant strains and potentially disastrous strains on our health system. And we can see that easily making 4 years impacts to life expectancy. But if we do follow the positive adaptation and listen to some of the things that Louise described we could do, we could be on our green revolution pathway. Much more positive adaptation, significant improvements in the availability and efficiency of green energy. There'll be positive changes to diet, exercise, and air quality, and potentially that positive reinforcement cycle of resilience that Hannah was describing. And we'll see considerable indirect positive benefits from things such as how we adapt our housing stocks and road traffic. And that would definitely lead to an increase in life expectancy. Now, just to make a concluding remark, these increases in life expectancy. First of all, they're compared to sort of the status quo of what what typically is being projected for UK society at the moment. But secondly, and really importantly, as I hand over to David for the policy side, is who do these life expectancies relate to? We often refer to climate change as being something about protecting the world for those who inherit it from us. I've stepped back from this, that this is not the life expectancy for the newborns or the current generation in their teens. This is someone much like myself, a 50-year-old now, today. The outcomes for that generation could have 6 years difference in life expectancy, depending on what we do about climate change. And that's the ultimate outcome, life expectancy. It's before we think about the health we would enjoy or not enjoy in the years running up to death. At which point, maybe, David, I should hand over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. And that sets things sort of very starkly in perspective. I will hand over straight to David, who is Chief Executive of ILC, and I think is going to talk us through a little bit of the sort of policy landscape and connections.
Thanks, Lily. Have I managed to share my screen competently? Okay, cool. Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to talk a bit about some work that my colleague Sophia did, and essentially we've been trying to pull together sort of a bit of an evidence review that connects understands the interconnections between climate change and longevity and aging. Really struck by Hannah's point about long-termism. Absolutely, you know, one of the reasons we're really interested in this area is because we need to the challenges of demographic change, of adapting to demographic change, are long-term challenges, as are the climate change ones, and getting policymakers to address those are subsequently very difficult. Really struck as well by Stephen's points around Northern and Southern Europe having just come back from Madrid, where, you know, and the summer we just had in the UK, although really struck by, actually, based on my experience in Madrid yesterday, where even in the late September it was 30 degrees and very hot, actually every street has both benches and trees and cover. And it's really striking that you have towns, you know, what we're not always talking about, particularly in the adaptation space, is extraordinarily expensive interventions. The difference as you're walking around Madrid, sitting under the tree and in 30 degrees heat where you're not under the tree, is astonishing. And yet in the UK, we're terrible. We seem terrible even at the basics. I think the second thing to sort of reflect on, which is, I suppose, you know, where I sort of want to start, is that, you know, much of the progress the UK has made, and the UK has made some pretty good progress in reducing carbon over the last sort of 10, 15 years or so, has been down to, in effect, government bulk energy, essentially decisions by government and, you know, for us. Going forward, clearly, there's going to have to be a lot more about us, a lot more about behaviour change, a lot more about what we do as ourselves. And clearly, whether you are younger or older, you know, actually getting into debates about, you know, what are the sort of houses we live in, how do we travel around, is extraordinarily important for all ages. And I fear at the moment we're a long way from winning the hearts and minds of many people, that actually perhaps the way we live our lives may not be appropriate for the future. And I think that is a very significant challenge, but I don't think it's exclusive to older people. So first thing I really want to say is sort of demographic change and climate change, absolutely interconnected. And our previous speakers have mentioned this. We know that demography will impact on our ability to adapt to climate change, but also that climate change will shape what longer lives look like. Our speakers have touched on some ways this will happen, but it's also really clear from the research we've done in this area that actually there is very little connection between these two agendas. And yet actually there's potential solutions that could work to bring them to the two areas together. If you look at some of the evidence, I won't say very much about this, but you know, clearly there is some very strong evidence around the impact of health on all ages, including older people, and without a doubt some of the oldest amongst us, some of those who, you know, are you know, may have other health conditions, some of the youngest are likely to be at most significant risk of some of the health implications also of climate change, also potentially less likely to be able to migrate, so potentially likely to find themselves, you know, unable to move from areas of high to low risk. And clearly, what we know from a global point of view is that you know, some of the world's conflict over recent years has been driven fundamentally by climate change and a chasing resources, and that's not likely to go away. And if older people in those communities can't move, they're the ones left in the places where it's extremely hot, where the access to food and things have been reduced. So climate change absolutely impacts upon all of us. Say HelpAge have done a little bit of work on this. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has done some work on climate change, essentially makes very similar points around sort of the risk of climate change to older people. But actually, and I know we've heard about this, with ILC, we're particularly keen and concerned around issues around inequalities, and you know where we live, our health and our wealth will absolutely impact the extent to which climate change has an impact upon us as individuals. And yet actually what we know is that age is being a bit polarized. We had the Greta sort of younger people are being let down by older people and those in power. You know, really strong, really striking, really powerful. Hannah's colleague Jonathan Porritt spoke at our conference recently, a couple of years ago, and was talking about, you know, actually, I think a call to action for older people to get to play their part. And I think the reality is that many do, and Jonathan did sort of recognize that. But it's undoubtedly true. There is a perception that older people don't get it, and I think it's an unhelpful perception, particularly given some of the other points I'll talk about as we go forward. Really, you know, because absolutely climate change is not an age issue, you know, and then, you know, it's interesting when you see even the newspaper photos of the Extinction Rebellion. If you look at the ages of the people on there, it's often not 20-year-olds, it's often the 70 or 80-year-olds who are standing on the front line. It's not just the teenagers, and I think we have to really recognize that actually you know, there is a group of environmentalists who have been very active since the 1970s, which is now 50 years ago, you know, so and they haven't lost that enthusiasm. And some of the evidence suggests older people might actually be more engaged in climate civic engagement than younger people. I ran a commission with the Green Alliance about 15 years ago on the environment, and actually we did sort of select committee approach and found that extraordinary interest from older people in how they could play their part and what they could and should do, but actually at the same time real concerns and a lack of understanding about what they could do. And the point earlier about interconnectedness is really important. You know, what is the best thing we could do, and how can we make sure that all of us know and are able to do that? Really clear though that if you particularly look globally at the policy environment in this space, it is hugely fragmented, and we know that the global policy environment on aging is pretty weak anyway there, but actually if you attempt to look at some of the big sort of frameworks and opportunities at a global level, for example, we've got the Decade of Healthy Aging, we've got the WHO work on aging and health, we've got a WHO networks on age-friendly cities, sustainable cities, digital cities. They sit separate from all of the work that the WHO and other global players like the UN are dealing with in relation to climate change. So we have a policy environment that is treating climate change as separate from longevity when it needs to be part of it. And even if you then look at the academic evidence, and there is really very little out there that links the two. There's a little bit from the Lancet in 2021 that talks about the connections, but essentially argues that, you know, the responses haven't been meaningful, and actually they do remain disconnected, and I think that remains fair to say. But from the work we've done, and looking at this area, I think we've identified at least 4 areas where we may want to strengthen the links. And I think it'd be great, for example, in terms of Hannah's work with business networks and health, around how we can do this. We're just kicking off a program of work, for example, on how we can get retailers to keep people healthy. Now, actually, as part of that, can we tie in the role of climate change? How can a high street pharmacy play a role in supporting information to keep people both healthy, but actually aware of the risks around climate change? And so I think there may be some really interesting opportunities there. So yeah, the four big areas. One, the longevity economy, obviously big for ILC. It's a really core area, how we maximize the economic contributions of old age. Without a doubt, the longevity economy could be a major driver. Secondly, sort of the relationship between sustainability and public health, and I think there's some real opportunities there. Thirdly, sustainable food and healthy aging, and finally the relationship between place, age-friendly places, sustainable places, and climate change. So I think there's 4 big areas there which are really big in themselves. And starting with the last one first. As I touched on before, there are separate policy networks and frameworks on healthy cities and age-friendly cities. Actually, the age-friendly communities agenda generally doesn't think about climate change, and it absolutely needs to. And equally, the agenda around sustainable transport, housing, and built environments often sort of neglect the challenges that come from old age in terms of adaptation and and I think, you know, actually, unless public policy in those areas can absolutely better recognise our different needs as we age, we're not about we're going to see very significant challenges in this space. On the other hand, you know, just to pick one example, sustainable transport, you know, the huge driver across the whole of Europe, and certainly the UK, whole of Europe, is of e-bikes, is older people. You know, e-bikes, extraordinary economic demand from people in their 50s and 60s for this space. So we absolutely need our place to be age friendly. moving on, in terms of food, there is quite a lot of literature in this space, particularly around food and health, as you would expect. But actually, there is also a little bit that recognises how food systems can tie in with population health and enhance environmental sustainability. And yet, actually, at the moment, they're threatening each other rather than supporting each other. Clearly, move towards healthier diets, more sustainable food, again links into Hannah's point that you can't have a healthy planet unless we're healthy ourselves, and I think that works both ways. Third area, and masses of potential here. Again, very little research. The King's Fund did some work in 2012 on this, looking at actually how public health can tie together with sustainability. And in fact, Stephen highlighted things like, the risk of, greater risks of infectious diseases as a result of climate change. Clearly, there is a role for public health in this space to help us all manage increased risks, but also reduce the likelihood of not just adapt, but also reduce the likelihood of that climate change being on Stephen's pretty terrible projected path. But clearly, there, as the King Funds highlights, that actually there is a benefit for public health and for the those advocating around climate change in terms of a huge number of areas, whether that be in terms of health, in terms of quality, or in terms of the finances. And we may come back to that later. And then the final sort of driver and potential link is around the longevity economy, an area where we've done a huge amount of work. We know that older consumers already spend, over 50 pence in the pound. It will become 64 pence in the pound. Age tends to be negatively related to green behavior, to intended green behavior, but positively with current green behavior. And it's really interesting talking to had a few conversations with some fairly big corporates who let's say sell detergent or cereal, and one of the things that's quite interesting about what they're saying is at the top end there is the big drive for green products is people in their 50s, 60s and 70s. They're the people who are buying the expensive green shampoos, and it's not just because of a wealth factor. It's actually there is a market there that we need to think. And then of course Stephen's area, and indeed the whole profession, the actuarial profession, clearly extraordinarily influential and important in terms of pensions. Pension funds have an extraordinarily important role to play here in terms of the assets and how that is used to influence change. And many of the people we work with, many of our partners, Legal and General, Phoenix for example, are absolutely saying we want to invest these assets in a way that don't damage the future. And they're doing it not out of they might be actually doing it a bit out of the fact that they care about it, because I think they genuinely do, but they're doing it because they realize that they're not going to have a business in 20 or 30 years time if actually they don't start investing in an economy that has a sustainable future. And I think that if the pension fund industry can't do it, no one can. So I think it's great we are starting to see that progress, and I think we can push that a little bit further. Clearly there are some things going on in this space, but actually really not much. There is very little that really does tie these two agendas together. There is a little bit in the UN Sustainable Development Goal on sustainable cities, which talks about cities being inclusive to older people as well as sustainable. The Lancet work talked about the optimum healthy diet for people and the planet. The government's done some work around age-friendly, energy-efficient homes, so recognizing the need for houses to be adapted to both age and both age-proofed and energy-efficient, proofed in terms of energy efficiency. Although I think it's worth reflecting that there are some real concerns at the moment that some of the sort of age-friendly design regulations may, there is a risk and a concern that we squeeze age-friendly design, that we essentially find design around climate change competes with design around age friendliness, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen, because actually we're not going to win friends in this debate if people start, if you start competing the issues against each other. And then, of course, the NHS has a net zero commitment, and sustainability extraordinarily important. And to be fair, the NHS has done huge amounts on this for a long time. So, just sort of to finish, sort of, for us in sort of thinking about this, it seems to us that the work that's going on in relation to advocating for a Green New Deal is not extraordinarily different from an ageing society New Deal. Essentially, good jobs are good for us, good places to work are good for young, they're good for old, good food is good for the environment and health, and actually we quite like it. Sustainable consumption makes us happy. Whilst, for a long time we've been advocating around the issues of, consumption in old age, what we've also been saying is we want consumption that supports well-being. We don't want people to be buying little bits of crap that they just, and I think that we've got to think about across our lives how we create, how we support sustainable consumption. And extraordinarily important in this place when older people are responsible for over half of older households responsible for over half of spending. And then, yes, absolutely, a sustainable health service is a better health service. So I think there is a vision there, and a vision that can draw things down. And in terms of how we get there, some ideas for us. One, clearly there is a real opportunity just simply to link the policy agendas of longevity and climate change. So the people at the WHO and the UN and UK policymakers need to be working together in this space, rather than have Department for Transport doing something and DWP doing something else and none of them talking to each other. We've got to, and that should be a relatively easy win. I think the delivering a green longevity dividend, absolutely possible for us to make sure and do a lot more to ensure that consumption and work in an aging society is sustainable, and actually do that from the perspective of all ages. I think absolutely easy win. And then I think finally that we do need to avoid this intergenerational conflict and get generations sort of working together, or at least in the, you don't always have to work at the same place, but actually not against each other on solutions in this space. And yes, the quote there from Jonathan, we need more older people to be champions, and I think that's fair. And at that point, I think I'm going to stop, except to say we do want to continue to work on this area, so please do really get in touch if you afterwards to talk about any ideas for collaboration. So at which point I'm going to pass back to Lily.
Brilliant. Thank you. And lots of food for thought in all those presentations. We've had a few questions through already, and I'd like to there's a couple of questions that sort of come to this, but that are sort of reflecting on, climate change, longevity, looking across sectors, across a much longer term. And I guess the immediate sort of question to all of you is, who do we need to engage as a result? If there are so many different actors who are involved, and how do we build urgency when there's immediate term crises that need to be dealt with clearly as well?
Do you want just any of us to jump in, Lily?
Yes, I should have said it's a difficult question to start with, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give an answer. I'm not saying this is the only possible answer at all, but certainly the way we try to approach it at Forum is trying to think, if we're convening a collaboration around a particular issue, is to deliberately try and do almost like a system diagnosis first. So like, who are the actors, the ones that are in the kind of obvious power play positions, but also those who aren't as well, because that might be community members or it might be people from a different sector. So kind of that mapping piece is important first, and then trying to convene a collaboration of interest around that. And I think just going to one of the questions that was in the Q&A is like, how do you get people to come when actually they've got different agendas, or they might be understanding the issue in a really different way? Is this will sound simplistic because it's actually very complicated in practice, but is everyone cares about something. And if we kind of go from the principle that things are connected and have interconnecting kind of risks and relationships to them, is trying to find those entry points of kind of care and passion. And it might be social justice for some people, it might be the built environment for someone else, it might be climate activism for someone else, it might be profit for someone else. It's like, what is that point of kind of care and passion? And then trying to use, and there's processes like deep democracy processes, for example, where you try to work to like, what is the common bit that people can agree on, and use that as the starting point. And collaborations are difficult to convene, and they can be slow and weighty to make progress. But I think those are at least some starting principles that we use on some of our sort of key big systemic collaborations. Really interested to hear how others tackle this.
Louise,
yeah, I think some other, I think that's absolutely right what Hannah's just said. I think some other things to bear in mind are that it's very easy to drift into using FUD, fear and uncertainty and doubt, but actually that's a very negative way. It makes people quite unwilling to engage because they actually don't want to think about the nasty things. So expressing it in terms of positives, expressing it in terms of, well, look, let's try and reduce emissions so that we can improve our air quality and have a better life in our cities. That's rather than let's try and reduce emissions so that we don't kill everybody. I mean, looking at the positive side often helps quite a lot. And I had something else that I was going to say, and it's completely gone out of my mind. Sorry.
well, let us know if it comes back. David, Stephen, any thoughts?
I'll echo what Hannah and Louise said. I think we always used to talk about longevity rather than mortality for exactly the same reason. We want to talk about the positives of life, and the more, it's very easy, and I did this myself, portrayed a picture of doom and gloom to some extent if we don't change. But that isn't what's going to motivate people. It is going to be those positives, making it tangible. So what would be, make it about the present, make it about something which we can all see a direct and relatively immediate benefit from. That that links back to Hannah's point around a commonality, a care and a passion. And that way I think people do coalesce. When we start talking about things like changing the world in 30 years, for a lot of people that feels too remote and too distant. So we have to do that translation to the present and to tangibles.
Sorry, if I can just pick up again. That's right. And it's actually incredibly difficult to do that, because a lot of the things we're talking about are where there's a complete difference in timescales between the actions and the impacts, that we need to take actions now, but the impacts won't emerge for some years in the future. And by the time they do emerge, it's going to be too late to do anything about them. So somehow we have to work out ways of thinking about this. And I think stories to tell, narratives to use, which make it seem important and beneficial now, the actions we need to take now. Whereas in fact, one of the real drivers is going to be impacts down the road, but people find that really difficult to think about. So what we have to do is to think about how to make it positive in the short term as well as in the long term. And the long term isn't actually that long. Let's be honest about this, as Stephen showed. I mean, the long term is 15, 20, 25 years.
Yeah, no, I don't think I disagree, and I think that going back to the first point from Hannah, I think the what drove me to sort of become a VSO volunteer or an Oxfam volunteer or a Friends of the Earth volunteer or a WWF volunteer when I was in my late teens and 20s was partly because I wanted to meet people and quite enjoyed that sort of thing. And whilst I do push a bit, and there's a question in the chat about sort of the case for generations to come together, frankly they haven't really got to. To what end is a really interesting question here. Actually what you really want, is it to inspire people like me and the 70-year-old and the 50-year-old to get involved in what they want to do and just do it. And actually a nice side effect of my involvement in VSO and Friends of the Earth and Oxfam was I made loads of friends in their 70s and 80s, which I wouldn't have but actually that wasn't my intention. And I think we need to sort of, think about sort of the intergenerational from that point of view. I think the sort of slightly, more difficult thing here is that actually, whereas in the UK, of course, clearly post-war, we had, very, very significant issues around visible air pollution, and we very quickly regulated. We very quickly introduced clean, work. If you look now to places like Hong Kong and Singapore and Korea and parts of China, you have very visible bits of Hong Kong, visible bits of air pollution, where actually it doesn't appear that there is a route to solve that. And the thing that's really worrying for me is that actually this is not invisible climate change, pollutants on it. This is explicit, visible sort of problems in some of the richest bits of the world where we don't appear to have the political will to solve them. And I think that for me is extraordinarily worrying. Sort of link it, and actually what it comes back to for me is, yes, we need to win hearts and minds of people, and I absolutely get that. But I'm going to play the nanny state bit a bit. You know what? People expect government to lead. People expect government to say you shouldn't drive as much. They expect people to say you shouldn't be living in these energy efficient homes, inefficient homes. They expect companies to do this. And it seems to me that actually, because in many places government is not leading, it's allowing individuals to say, oh well, government's not saying I have to do this, so I'm not going to bother. And I think that the power of government, and my view is, some of the things we're talking about, creating a nice world, you would expect to be extraordinarily popular from a democratic point, not unpopular.
Just picking up on that, because I think earlier, Hannah, you were talking as well about the kind of point where people get beyond what they think is in their own sort of sphere of influence. And clearly when we're talking about individuals, they can't change everything necessarily by themselves. I guess it's sort of a more general question really to the room is where do you see some of that responsibility? How can individuals really help? What's the role of businesses, of charities, of governments?
I think there's a huge danger here that we put it all on the individual and make individual people feel guilty that they're not doing enough, or that however much they do, they can't change anything. The point is, this is a systems problem. We need systems changes. It can't be just single individuals. It's got to be tackled at the policy level, at the governmental level, at the societal level. So one of the most powerful things individuals can do, I think, is to push it up to that level, is to lobby their politicians, to lobby their pension funds, to lobby their employers, to talk about it to everybody, so it becomes normal to have a conversation about, isn't this concerning, this is what we can do, rather than being seen as on the fringe. So if you make it normal, then it's much easier for the governmental players to step in, because I know we say that the government should be leaders, but let's face up to some reality here, is that they tend to want to do what people want them to do.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that, Louise. And I think it's worth noting that the term carbon footprint was created by BP, and as an intentional strategy a couple of decades ago to try and push responsibility onto individuals. And of course, yes, we all can make choices that are better or worse, and we can influence in that regard. But I think it's applying political pressure and also consumer pressure that we'll start to see the bigger systemic changes. And I think one of the things, forum, that we often talk about is when you look at a system and you can kind of see where there's dynamism, and kind of you look at kind of signals of change of things that are happening, and there might be clusters of activism here or clusters of policy change happening up here. But it's like, where can you amplify where there's energy? Because if there's loads of resistance, maybe don't bother focusing on that. Focus on where there's energy, because actually, given time, then that might shift where the resistance occurs as well. So kind of almost looking at in that way of where there's dynamism and change is kind of a helpful way of choosing where to focus as well.
I'm going to quickly jump over to Stephen. There's a question here, and I guess it builds into this question of interconnectedness, but also how we build urgency. And clearly there's potential power of kind of data and telling us where those sort of tipping points are. But what are the challenges when we're talking about such a complex thing, really, in actually modelling and making sort of predictions?
Thanks, Lily. I think the big challenge, and it's the challenge that many organisations who try and do this modelling face, is the fact that there's a certain amount you can do with you can do fairly robustly, as I illustrated at the start of my session, with quantitative data and be able to get a feel for. But I still have a rule of thumb that well over 2/3 of any of the impacts that you're going to try and quantify, we currently don't have good data. We don't have a mechanism to readily model using sort of tried and tested methods onto historical data. And the reason I say that is so much of the outcomes are around the pathways we follow and how it ripples through that interconnected system and how it feeds through to our health systems. And do we hit a tipping point where things become amplified for the negative, or indeed a tipping point in terms of positive change where amplified to the benefit of human health? And so because of that, a lot of the biggest challenge is actually stepping back and bringing in actually appreciating just how connected health, economics and the climate are, to understand how they interplay with each other, and ultimately having to try and do quite a lot of what if the world map of vector-borne diseases looks more like this? What could that mean? What is that going to mean for the resilience of our populations to infectious diseases? How bad could infectious diseases get? What have we seen in a very long time ago, before we had effective means of combating infectious diseases? And you start having to build up really a picture of, on one side, how bad could it get, but also the other side, how good could it get? How much possibility for how much can we realistically go if we positively adapt? What might that mean? Because it is positive adaptation in terms of reducing the impact we have on global climate can have really strong health benefits, but it also comes with challenges, because it will come with those challenges like, actually, how do we replace what is a global food production system and mass transportation system with something that's more sustainable, that is more local, that is more building that resilience of local networks? And that's not immediately obvious that that's going to be that would in isolation not impact in a health negatively. You'd have to do that. There's some quite important controls and things that have to go around that, to when we're also then thinking about the implications of the changes we will need to make. So essentially, it's a lot of qualitative work looking at what ifs at this stage, really, which also therefore makes it challenging to put high degrees of confidence or certainty on these outcomes.
Thanks. And sort of looking on clearly we've spoken about, more positive sides to things and focusing on, are there some really kind of quick wins that you think, oh, actually, look, there are some things that we know work, both in terms of sort of climate as well as sort of demographic sustainability, that might be able to make the argument a little more than something that will take sort of 20 years to deliver?
Shall I come in on the first? I'll come in on the first one. I think, clearly one fairly obvious one is that the one thing we know absolutely works, almost in terms of preventing almost anything you could think of, is physical activity. And the one way we know that you can actually get people to do physical activity, and it's one of the only ways we know you can convince people to do it, is active travel. So there is absolutely a win-win in investing in active travel, in terms of, we absolutely know it prevents disease. We absolutely know it's good for us. We absolutely know none of us really want to do physical activity because we prefer not to, but active travel is a really easy way to do it, and there are some massive carbon potential benefits for for doing so. And I think, you know, areas like that, creating the right sort of environment to support active travel. And again, the work we're doing around retail, for example, you know, actually how do you support people to get around to and around town centres in a really sustainable way, should be, you know, linking into the previous points, and be about fun as much as about, you know, about actually, oh God, I've got to go to that park and ride 4 miles outside and then get the horrific bus. You know, let's get all the people on the scooters. Let's, you know, let's create, you know, last mile mobility where actually you're not going to get wet, but where actually you have got somewhere to store, you know, your shopping, and where you've then got somewhere to support you, you know, secure to support your to store your e-bike while you're in the betting shop or wherever you want to go. You know, so I think there's got to be something around. I think for me, active travel's got to be an obvious link between health, healthy aging, and indeed sustainability.
I think that's great. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. Another one I'd put in a word for is retrofitting of housing. I think that we need to retrofit both for insulation in winter to reduce energy use and to improve people's living standards, help them with the cost of living, but also for good ventilation in summer. And you know, all these things mean that people can stay living where they're used to living. We've got a lot of old housing stock in this country, and just knocking it down and starting again is just never going to happen, would be incredibly expensive and absolutely disastrous as far as carbon emissions were concerned. But retrofitting is something that we really, really need to take seriously.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
sorry, go on, Hannah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just
No.
I was just going to sort of, you know, violently agree. I think, you know, the potential around, you know, making our houses work nicer for us is so important in this space. And I think I probably said it before on an ILC event. I worked in Romania for a year or so, and I worked in an office where we had 2 offices, and one of the offices had a tree outside and one didn't, and the difference in temperature was about 15 degrees, just as a result of that. And similarly, you know, low level insulation into housing, you know, much more, you know, short-term returns cost effective than putting the solar panels on the roof. You know, there are things we can absolutely do to make our houses work better for us, and yet I think that and that's the sort of point around making sure policy doesn't compete climate objectives with sort of objectives around age friendliness is so important, because actually we've got to make sure that, you know, the buildings we build are appropriate for all of us. And it's still the case, you know, I don't, you know, as someone who is vaguely who, you know, we do quite a bit on housing and planning and buildings and planning, and you see the huge amount of regulations in this space, and then you still see schools being built with huge glass windows which are far too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter, and it just it's amazing. I don't really understand, in the world of that regulation we have of buildings, how we're still doing this now, and there has to be a responsibility on house builders here, actually, and I think house builders have got to see that. And I think, interestingly, well, you know, let me jump back to my positive from my negative. Talking to another of our partners, talking to Audley recently, and another of their organizations we work with in the housing space, retirement community space. They I hope I'm not giving away anything commercial. I don't think I am. They said that now, you know, they go to these you know, they go and do these sessions with residents and potential residents and sales things, and literally the first question people ask is now about energy efficiency. This is not the second question, like, and it's not just one person. They'll have 3 or 4 people saying, well, if I'm going to move into this, what will my energy bills be? What will I, you know, how it, so there has to be a case for, you know, us starting to build better and making the case for selling better. And as part of that, as you say, Louise, it's about adapting existing stuff. It's about, you know, investing in the housing stock of older people is actually about investing in the housing stock. And it's, you know, for any of you who've had experience of you know, and as someone who moved to Bognor Regis and looked at 8 or 9, 10 different houses, where actually the majority of them had someone who died sunlight in the house previously, and you know, housing conditions were pretty terrible. You know, you have 15 years at the end of life where people stop investing in this. And I think we've got to find ways of supporting people to continue to invest in their housing stock, and the good on the ground it's good for them, but it's also good for future generations. And clearly what Labour did, of course, in the public space, in public housing, was the investment in decent homes, billions and billions of pounds worth of investment, but actually very little of that went into private rented or into owner occupiers. You know, there is a big gap in terms of quality of housing, and you've got a lot of people who bought their own houses under right to buy who are living in increasingly poor housing, and we've got to find ways of incentivizing some of these things, even if for example, you know, and there is an obvious, you know, issue, you know, if you think, well, I'm only going to be living here 10 years, why would I put in that if, you know, the solar panels, if actually my return on investment is going to be 10 years? You know, actually we need to find ways of financially incentivizing people to do it. So yeah.
Thank you. Hannah, did you want to come in as well?
I think it's pretty much been said. All I was going to add really is that the IPCC has identified that, like, for example, economies like the UK, where we've got quite a lot of old housing stock, is that retrofit is going to be by far our best sort of carbon approach, not new builds. Of course, new builds should have these things built into it, but actually a lot of our housing stock is old and the carbon's already been invested in it, it's embodied in it already. And so there really needs to be a better kind of a narrative push, as well as both policy and finances around that, because retrofit doesn't sound as exciting, doesn't tend to look as good as, you know, a new passive house community, for example. So I think that that's a shift that does need to happen. And just to one of the points that was made in the Q&A is, you know, well, how about renters and how can they apply pressure onto landlords? And also, shouldn't new builds have some of these things built in? Absolutely. But again, I think that goes back to the enabling policy environment. We actually had better enabling policy environment for things like microgeneration a few years ago, and that's changed. So, like, again, where can we apply pressure for those changes to happen, again, to make it a more enabling environment for those things? And then an enforcing environment. So for landlords who might be reluctant, what's the enforcing environment for that?
And just a very quick follow-on question, I guess, in the Q&A, there are lots of questions around sort of energy and everything as well. Do you think the cost of living crisis can build a bit more of that demand for energy efficient housing? Is that something where people actually do start telling their landlords, look, you know, rent's too high if I'm going to have to pay X £100 each month on bills as well? Sorry, that was to you, Hannah. Do you think there's a chance that kind of increases demand?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. And this is why I think these things need to kind of go in tandem with each other. Sorry, I hadn't realised that here.
No.
Me. But yeah, absolutely.
And just to add, you know, I think it was. I'm on the risk of misquoting Jonathan Pryor here, but I think it was in one of his books that he talked about actually, and you know, and it was from the, you know, the early 90s, late 80s, early 1990s, which doesn't feel very long at all ago. But you know, that he makes the point that actually, whilst energy was cheap, there was no incentive for industry or others to invest, and I think it was absolutely the case that, you know, for most industries 30 years ago, energy was not, it was actually too cheap for it to become a boardroom issue, and that's absolutely not true anymore. It's absolutely important, and it's important from the point of view of the sustainability of the business, but also the customers. The work that Iceland have been talking about in terms of a recognition that if their energy bills go up, they're going to have to increase the price of their products, and they're really concerned that actually their audience isn't going to be able to afford it. So really, I think there is absolutely a case that actually, I think the other thing actually I should say, I think Jonathan had in his book was that that this has become a real issue when people have started making disaster movies about it, and actually now it's hard to imagine that because we've had 15 years of environmental disaster movies, but actually it does feel that that we are getting into popular culture a greater recognition, and clearly what you don't want to do is essentially force people to respond just because their energy bills are too high, and clearly that clearly not a good thing from a social point of view as much as anything else. But for businesses, clearly there is it changes the economics in terms of what we buy ourselves as individuals and what businesses buy.
One question, can I come back to that, David? I guess we've been talking a lot about how longevity and climate change do fit together. But clearly there aren't the same kind of disaster movies around kind of aging, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of scare tactics, sort of comms as well. But do you think there is still a challenge that it isn't seen, longevity isn't seen as a sort of similarly defining trend, and that it's even harder there to kind of get that sort of long-termism into policy?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. The complete lack of recognition around sort of longevity and its impact is absolutely there, and interestingly though, I do because I do reflect on that Jonathan point a bit around films in terms of age. If you look the last 10 years or so, there have been an astonishing number of amazing films that have been about relationships in old age, which you didn't used to see. There have been lots of things about sort of the older man and and the man who drives his car, and the two older men, and and actually, so I think we're and you even had the intern program, and so you're starting to see, age not being invisible, and actually you are starting even to see, 50-year-old men getting married to 50-year-old women instead of 20-year-old women in cinema. You are actually starting to see Hollywood recognize that actually it was completely inappropriate to pretend that older men didn't age but older women did. And I think that's part of progress in sort of recognizing that, look, actually we're all aging as a society, and that actually it is a really important cultural trend, and so I think there has been a bit of progress in there. We probably need a few more harder ones, not the sort of all the lovely intergenerational stuff. Let's have some mean generations against each other stuff in Hollywood, and that might inspire some debate.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's been a really, really interesting discussion. I think what I'm going to ask you all to have a little bit of a think about while I just go through the next few slides is the sort of, if you had your magic public policy wand, what is the one thing you would like to change? So David, would you mind just going ahead a couple of slides? So I just wanted to mention as well our Future of Aging conference, which is coming up in November. So we'll be celebrating our 25th anniversary and really using it as an opportunity to look back a little bit on what's changed over the last 25 years in terms of longevity, in terms of other trends like climate change and technology, and where we might be heading. So if you haven't registered yet, do take a look on our website. And if you could just click ahead again. Oh, that's just a big thank you. So yeah, do you mind if I just start picking on one of you to say what's your one thing you'd love to change? Louise, you're unmuted, so I'm going to go to you first.
I don't know. There's so many things that need doing. I think what I'd really like is for governments to take well, especially the climate emergency, but as we've so eloquently said, especially David, you can't think about the climate emergency without thinking about the aging population. It's so intertwined, is to actually take action and not just spout words.
Great, thank you. Hannah?
I think I'm going to refer to, I think it's Stephen Boxall's question, which is about neoliberal capitalism, so not a small one, is I think fundamentally neoliberal capitalism fails the majority and it fails the planet. It serves a relatively small number very well. So it's not that the system is broken under its current goals, it's just that the goals need reframing. So it's worked. There's lots of profits being generated. There's just the distribution is poor and the exploitation that it's based upon it is unsustainable. So I think it's that we need to be really rethinking our goals of our society and our economy. And it's not that profit inherently is wrong, it's that profit in pursuit of goals that then don't serve other agendas is actually clearly not a viable or sustainable model. So rethinking what capitalism look like when you start to bring in well-being, when you start to bring in kind of externalities of our planetary kind of constraints, that I think is key, which is huge, obviously. but fundamentally that I think underpins so much of society, and it's our relationship with that and the relationship with the resources around us and those around us that's key.
Thank you, Hannah. Can I move on to you, Stephen?
Of course, and like Louise, I found it an incredibly tough question. I think I initially dwelled on the climate accountability, much like Hannah was saying, changing the way we hold our corporates accountable in terms of profit streams. I think that's very important. To some extent, though, if we can, if that's Hannah's one, and we can trigger that better commercial dynamics of corporates to go the right way, I'd like the government to focus on the things that corporates won't be able to do in the short, immediate term, but actually get to look policy to implement some of the big infrastructural changes that we're going to need for the next, to actually do a manageable transition at the pace we need. And that includes such things as energy distribution networks. It includes such things as the logistics of distribution of supplies around the country, and the local infrastructure that enables that local resilience that Hannah was describing. So that's what I'd probably call upon from a policy perspective.
Thank you. And David?
Great. I'm gonna stick with my. I think active travel is a win-win for both in terms of climate change and individuals. But I'm just gonna be naughty and add two others. Which one is, I think, given the audience and the involvement of the actuarial profession here, absolutely an extraordinarily important role for the pensions and the insurance industry to lead the way here, whether that be with people like Stephen and others in the profession giving us the data that we need and helping us with projecting impact, but also in terms of the pensions, insurance and investment industry and what they invest in. And they've got a very, very strong case for an economic case for investing in the right areas, but also clearly are going to be having to be thinking about what new products we need to support ourselves, and then to a much simpler, a more basic level, just making sure it's really easy for all of us who want to switch to a green pension to do it. Actually we shouldn't be making these things as complicated as we do, and I think that there is more to be done there. And then the final thing is clearly, in terms of we absolutely need to make sure that initiatives around net zero, around climate change, actually do tie together longevity and demography where appropriate, that we look at things like health and longevity and how it does interrelate, and how we can make most of net zero to support us all to be healthier and happier. And on that, I think there is a huge amount of really interesting stuff out there, but also there is still a real gap for consumers and individuals to understand the links and understand what they can do. And a very, very minor point, as a 12-person organization, it's astonishingly how difficult for us to even measure our own climate impact. There is pretty much nothing out there that would help us do this in any way that is meaningful and useful. And given that most businesses in the UK are SMEs, there is a massive challenge here that actually we need to be stepping up to. And hopefully maybe someone in the audience will create something that's a little bit more sophisticated than the WWF what's my climate impact thing, to actually, not that I'm being critical of it, but actually just something that is genuinely useful for small businesses and individuals to what and how our behavior change, what we can do that could deliver change in this space and make the world nicer for us all.
Okay, well, thank you all. I'm not going to try and summarize this. So thanks to all our speakers, thanks to everyone who joined us and put in your questions today. And a special thanks to the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries for making this possible. We are going to try and somehow summarize the thoughts from this into a short little paper that we'll publish after the webinar. So we'll be circulating that with everyone. And yes, just thank you to all of you, and we hope to see you at our future events.